That day with my teacher was one of the craziest days of my life, as he surprised me in an exciting way I had never expected. It all happened a couple weeks ago. The final bell had rung, and with the other students gone, the sound of the overhead fan and the occasional scrape of a chair across the floor felt almost deafening. I glanced up from my desk, where the faint pencil smudges on my worksheet blurred together, and my gaze inevitably landed on Mr. Delvin. He was seated at his desk, leaning slightly forward as he marked papers with the kind of concentration that made him oblivious to the world around him. His tie was loosened, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up to reveal forearms that seemed incongruously strong for a history teacher. The sight was enough to make my stomach tighten, though I quickly turned my attention back to my worksheet when I realized I'd been staring for too long. I didn't usually stay after school. The few other students who had lingered had left 10 minutes ago, leaving me alone in the room with him. I told myself it was because I needed to finish this assignment. But deep down I knew it wasn't the whole truth. Being here in the quiet with just him, it felt different, intimate in a way I couldn't explain. Still working on that? His voice broke the silence, smooth and steady, pulling my focus back to him. Yeah, I replied quickly, sitting up straighter. Just a couple more questions. He smiled faintly, setting his pen down and leaning back in his chair. You're one of the few students who actually takes this seriously, he said, his tone somewhere between admiration and amusement. I felt my cheeks heat up at the compliment, though I wasn't sure why. I guess I just don't want to fall behind, I said, shrugging as if it wasn't a big deal. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than felt necessary. It's a good habit, he said, almost thoughtfully. Most people don't realize how much their choices now shape their future. There was something about the way he said it, so earnest, so intent, that made my chest tighten. I managed a small smile before turning back to my worksheet, though the words on the page seemed to swim before my eyes for a while. The only sounds were the faint scratch of my pencil and the occasional rustle of paper as he shifted through his stack of assignments. I tried to focus, but I could feel his presence, could sense the way the air in the room seemed heavier with just the two of us in it. I'll be right back, he said suddenly, standing and stretching. His chair scraped against the floor as he pushed it back, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Okay, I said, my voice coming out softer than I intended. I watched him walk toward the door. The way his movements were unhurried, confident in a way that made it impossible to look away. The door clicked softly shut behind him, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Alone now, the silence seemed even louder. I tapped my pencil against the desk, my thoughts racing as I tried to understand why my chest felt so tight. Why my pulse quickened every time he spoke to me. It wasn't like I hadn't noticed him before. Mr. Delvin wasn't just a good teacher. He was the kind of teacher who made you want to pay attention. He had a way of making history come alive, his voice carrying a natural charisma that drew everyone in. But for me, it was something more than that. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. This is stupid, I told myself. He's just being nice, just doing his job. It doesn't mean anything. The door opened again, and he stepped back inside, his expression calm as he returned to his desk. He didn't say anything, but I felt his gaze on me as he sat down. You're awfully quiet today, he said after a moment, his tone light but curious. "I guess I'm just focused," I replied, forcing a small smile. "Good," he said, though there was something in his voice that made my stomach twist. "Focus is important." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room before settling on me again. "You don't usually stay this late," he said, almost as if he were thinking aloud. I shrugged, keeping my tone as casual as I could. "I just wanted to get this done." He nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful, as though he were trying to piece something together. "You know," he said finally, "you can always come to me if you need help with anything." The offer felt heavier than it should have, his words lingering in the air like an unspoken promise. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Thanks," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly, his gaze steady on mine before he turned back to his work. The room fell quiet again, but the tension lingered, thick and palpable. When I finally finished the assignment, I gathered my things and stood, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. "I'll see you tomorrow," I said, slinging my bag over my shoulder. "Take care," he replied, his voice warm but unreadable, as I walked out of the classroom and into the empty hallway. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. The air felt heavier, my chest tighter, and my thoughts more tangled than ever. The hallway felt unnervingly quiet as I walked away from the classroom. The weight of his words lingering in my mind. "You can always come to me." It sounded simple on the surface, but the way he'd said it carried something more, something I couldn't ignore. His tone, the way his eyes lingered just a moment too long, it was enough to send my thoughts into overdrive. I pushed the door to the nearest bathroom open, letting it swing shut behind me. The tiles gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the faint hum of the ventilation system filled the space. I stepped up to the sink, turning on the faucet and letting the cool water run over my hands. The sensation grounded me for a moment, pulling me out of my spiraling thoughts. Leaning forward, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face was flushed, the heat still lingering in my cheeks from our conversation. I shook my head, trying to banish the tension that had built in my chest. He was just being nice, I told myself again. That was all it was. Teachers were supposed to care about their students, and I was reading too much into it. And yet, no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about the way he looked at me. The way he spoke to me. The memory of his voice, calm and steady, replayed in my mind, and I found myself gripping the edge of the sink a little tighter. The bathroom door creaked open, and my heart skipped a beat. I turned instinctively, expecting another student, but when I saw who it was, my breath caught in my throat. "Mr. Delvin." He paused just inside the doorway, his eyes meeting mine briefly before he stepped further into the room. The door closed softly behind him, and the faint echo of the latch clicking into place seemed to reverberate through the tiled space. "Hey," he said, his voice low but casual. "Didn't mean to startle you." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "It's fine," I said quickly, turning back to the sink in an attempt to steady myself. The water was still running, the sound filling the otherwise quiet room. "I noticed you left in a bit of a hurry," he said, leaning against the wall near the door. His posture was relaxed, but there was something about the way his gaze lingered on me that made the air feel heavier. "Just needed a minute," I replied, my voice unsteady. I turned off the faucet and grabbed a paper towel, keeping my eyes focused on the motion of drying my hands. "Rough day?" he asked, his tone softer now. I shrugged, unsure how to answer. "Something like that." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You've seemed a little off lately," he said after a moment. "Not just today. Can I help you with something?" I froze, my hands stilling as I balled up the paper towel. "I'm fine," I said quickly, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond right away, and the silence that followed felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't name. I dared to glance at him through the mirror, and the intensity in his eyes made my chest tighten. He wasn't looking at me like a teacher watching over a student. There was something deeper, more personal in his gaze. "You don't have to keep everything bottled up," he said, taking a slow step closer. "If something's bothering you, you can talk to me." I turned to face him fully, the sink pressing into my lower back as I gripped its edge for support. "I'm fine," I repeated, though the words felt hollow. My heart was racing now, each beat echoing loudly in my ears as the space between us seemed to shrink. "You sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a murmur. He took another step forward, his movements careful, deliberate. His presence was overwhelming, his closeness making it hard to think straight. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was an answer to his question or a desperate attempt to convince myself that I could handle whatever this was. "I'm sure," I said, my voice trembling. His gaze softened, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable. "You've been on my mind lately," he admitted, his tone quiet but steady. "I don't know if you've noticed, but I see how hard you try. How much you care." The words hit me like a jolt, and I felt my breath hitch. "Thanks," I said, the word coming out awkward and uneven. I couldn't meet his eyes anymore, my gaze dropping to the tiled floor as my grip on the sink tightened. "You don't have to thank me," he said, taking another step closer. I want you to know that you're not alone." His voice was so gentle, so genuine, that it made my chest ache. I looked up then, meeting his gaze, and the intensity in his eyes made my knees feel weak. There was something unspoken between us, something I didn't have the words to name but could feel in every fiber of my being. The distance between us had all but disappeared now, and I could feel the heat radiating from him, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. The tension was unbearable, a magnetic pull drawing us closer even as my mind screamed at me to move, to say something, to do anything to break the spell. "Mr. Delvin," I started, but my voice faltered. I wasn't sure what I was going to say, or if I even wanted to say anything at all. "Call me James," he said softly, the words slipping out like a quiet invitation. I froze, the weight of his name hanging in the air between us. My chest tightened, my pulse hammering as I stared up at him. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped, the world narrowing to just the two of us in this small, quiet room. And then, as if he could sense my hesitation, he took one final step forward, closing the distance between us completely. His hand reached out, brushing against mine in a touch so light it sent a shiver down my spine. His fingers lingered near mine for a moment that felt like an eternity. A soft and fleeting touch that sent a shiver through me. My breath hitched, the air between us thick and heavy. The faint hum of the bathroom fan seemed to fade into the background, drowned out by the pounding of my heartbeat. "James," I whispered, the name feeling strange yet natural on my tongue. His lips quirked into a faint smile, though his eyes held something deeper, something that made my chest tighten. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I want you to know I'm here." The sincerity in his tone disarmed me, leaving me vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. His hand brushed against mine again, the touch deliberate this time, as if he were testing the boundaries, waiting to see if I would pull away. I didn't. The realization sent a wave of conflicting emotions crashing over me: fear, exhilaration, anticipation, all swirling together in a way that made it impossible to think clearly. His presence was overwhelming, the faint scent of his cologne filling the air as his hand moved slightly closer, his fingertips grazing mine. "James," I said again, my voice trembling. I don't know. It's okay." He interrupted gently, his gaze steady on mine. "We don't have to figure it all out right now." His words were calming, grounding in a way that made me feel like the floor wasn't slipping out from under me. But they also carried a weight, an acknowledgement of something neither of us had dared to say aloud. I looked down at our hands, his so close to mine that I could feel the warmth of his skin. My fingers twitched, a part of me wanting to pull back, to create distance, but another part, stronger, louder, urged me to stay. The silence stretched between us, charged and electric. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one colliding with the next, but none of them felt clear. All I knew was that he was there, inches away, his presence filling the space in a way that felt both comforting and terrifying. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. I'd never hurt you." The vulnerability in his tone caught me off guard, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name, something warm and tender that made my chest ache. I looked up at him, my gaze meeting his, and for the first time I saw the hesitation in his eyes, the flicker of uncertainty that mirrored my own. "I'm not afraid," I said, though my voice wavered. He nodded slowly, his eyes searching mine as if looking for confirmation. "Okay," he said quietly. The tension in the air was almost unbearable now, the pull between us growing stronger with every passing second. He took another step closer, his hand finally resting over mine, his touch gentle but firm. The heat of his palm against my skin sent a jolt through me, and I felt my breath catch again. I didn't plan this," he admitted, his voice low and steady. "But I can't ignore it anymore." "Ignore what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "The way I feel," he said simply, his gaze never wavering. "About you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. My chest tightened, my pulse pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. "I know it's not fair to put this on you," he continued, his voice softer now. "I know there are lines we're not supposed to cross, but I can't pretend anymore." My mind spun, trying to make sense of what he was saying, of the emotions that flickered across his face. There was a vulnerability in him now, a rawness that made him seem both larger than life and impossibly human. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly, his hand tightening slightly over mine. I needed you to know." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, the weight of his confession settling over us like a heavy blanket. I stared at him, my heart racing as I tried to process the enormity of what was happening. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he leaned in closer, his movements slow and deliberate. His free hand reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face, his fingertips grazing my skin in a touch so light it sent a shiver down my spine. My breath hitched, and I felt my pulse quicken as he hesitated, his gaze searching mine for permission. I didn't move, didn't speak, but something in my expression must have been enough because he closed the remaining distance between us. The moment his lips brushed against mine, the world seemed to tilt. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if he were testing the waters. But as the seconds stretched on, it deepened, the tension that had been building between us finally snapping like a taut wire. His hand moved to the back of my neck, his touch firm yet gentle as he pulled me closer. My hands, which had been frozen at my sides, found their way to his chest, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as I leaned into him. The kiss was everything and nothing like I'd imagined, electric, intense, and overwhelming in the best possible way. It felt like the culmination of every unspoken word, every lingering glance, every moment of tension that had brought us to this point. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard, the air between us charged with an energy that left me dizzy. His forehead rested against mine, his eyes closed as he let out a shaky breath. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was still reeling, my body still tingling from the intensity of the moment. But even as the weight of what had just happened began to settle over me, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. The silence after the kiss felt louder than anything I'd ever experienced. My heart was pounding, each beat echoing in my ears as the gravity of what had just happened settled over us. James's hand was still on the back of my neck, his touch steady but hesitant, as if he wasn't ready to let go yet, or wasn't sure if he should. I opened my eyes slowly, my breath still uneven, and met his gaze. His expression was a mix of emotions, vulnerability, hesitation, and something else I couldn't quite name. The raw honesty in his eyes made my chest tighten, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. I wasn't even sure I could speak. The craziest part was that I felt that this wasn't over, and I could feel he felt that too. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. But even as he said the words, his hand didn't move, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin. "I didn't mean to. I shouldn't have." I shook my head, cutting him off. "Don't," I said softly, my voice steadier than I expected. "Don't apologize." He looked at me, his brow furrowing slightly. "But this isn't. I mean, we can't." "I know," I interrupted, my voice trembling slightly. "But I don't regret it." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. His grip on the back of my neck loosened slightly. But he didn't pull away, his gaze searching mine for something, confirmation, reassurance, or maybe just understanding. "I don't either," he admitted after a moment, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. The admission sent a jolt through me, my pulse quickening as I processed his words. It was one thing to feel the pull between us, to sense the tension building over time, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. "But it doesn't make it right," he added, his tone tinged with regret. I looked away, the weight of his words settling in my chest like a stone. He was right. Of course he was right. There were 100 reasons why this couldn't happen, why it shouldn't have happened. But none of them seemed to matter in that moment. James, I said quietly, the name feeling exciting, almost fragile, on my lips. I don't know what this is. But I don't want it to just. I hesitated, searching for the right words. I don't want it to just end here. So let's don't then. Let me, he replied. He noticed I let my guards down, and in that moment the tension snapped. He turned me around and wow, this was crazy. What were we doing? I just couldn't tell. After I think 20 to 30 minutes we were done. He let out a shaky breath, his hand finally dropping from my neck. The loss of his touch was immediate, leaving behind a coldness that made me ache. He stepped back slightly, his gaze dropping to the floor as he ran a hand through his hair. This is dangerous, he said, his voice strained. For both of us. I know, I said quickly, my voice rising slightly. But that doesn't change how I feel. His head snapped up, his eyes locking onto mine. And how do you feel? He asked, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. Hope, fear, or maybe both. I hesitated, my throat tightening as I struggled to find the words. I don't know, I admitted finally. But I know it's real. The vulnerability in my voice seemed to catch him off guard. And for a moment he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he stepped closer, his movements careful, deliberate, as if he were testing the boundaries all over again. You're not alone in this, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I feel it too. The admission sent a wave of relief and fear crashing over me at the same time. Relief because I wasn't imagining it. This connection, this pull between us. But fear because acknowledging it meant there was no turning back. We were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Stepping into uncharted territory with no idea of what lay ahead. What do we do now? I asked, my voice trembling. He exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging slightly as if the weight of the question was too much. I don't know, he said honestly, but I know we can't stay here. I nodded, understanding what he meant. The bathroom, with its harsh fluorescent lights and echoing silence, suddenly felt too small, too exposed. The walls seemed to press in around us, and I could feel my chest tightening with the weight of everything left unsaid. He stepped back, creating more space between us, though the air between us still felt charged. We should go, he said, his tone firmer now, before anyone notices we're both still here. I swallowed hard, nodding again as I tried to steady my breathing. My legs felt unsteady as I moved toward the door, my hand hovering over the handle. I hesitated, glancing back at him one last time. James, I said quietly, his name a soft plea on my lips. He looked at me, his expression softening. It's going to be okay, he said, though I wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure me or himself. With that, I turned the handle and stepped out into the hallway. The cool air hit me immediately, a stark contrast to the warmth that had lingered between us. My heart was still racing as I made my way toward the exit. My thoughts a tangled mess of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. The walk home felt surreal. Like I was caught in some dreamlike haze where the world moved around me but I wasn't really a part of it. This wasn't over. The setting sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk. The faint hum of distant traffic blending with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. My mind was spinning, replaying every moment, every word, every touch. His voice echoed in my head, "It's going to be okay." But what did that even mean? Was it okay to feel this way? To have stepped into something that felt so utterly right and so undeniably wrong at the same time? My chest tightened with the weight of it all. The questions I didn't have answers to swirling endlessly in my mind. When I finally reached my house, I went straight to my room, closing the door softly behind me. The familiar space felt foreign now, as if I'd stepped into another version of my life where nothing made sense anymore. I dropped my bag onto the floor and sank onto my bed, staring up at the ceiling as I tried to process everything. James. I couldn't stop thinking about him, his eyes. The way they softened when he looked at me. His voice steady yet vulnerable. The way he said my name, like it meant something. My fingers drifted to my lips, and I felt a warmth spread through me at the memory of the kiss. The way it had felt like the culmination of every unspoken moment between us. But along with the warmth came a wave of fear. What happened next? How were we supposed to navigate this now that the line had been crossed? Would he pretend it never happened? Go back to being the composed and professional teacher everyone admired? Or would it linger between us? A quiet secret we both carried but never spoke of? I closed my eyes, letting out a shaky breath as I tried to steady myself. The memory of his touch, his words, was still so vivid, so real, that it made my chest ache. I didn't want to lose that feeling, even though I knew how dangerous it was to hold on to it. The next day at school felt like walking on a tightrope. Every step, every glance, every interaction was charged with the possibility of tipping over into something I wasn't ready to face. I avoided the hallway near his classroom, taking the long way around the building just to avoid the possibility of running into him. But I couldn't avoid him forever. By the time fourth period rolled around, my heart was pounding in my chest as I made my way to his classroom. The door was open, and I could hear the faint murmur of students chatting as they waited for the lesson to begin. I hesitated in the doorway, my gaze scanning the room until it landed on him. He was standing at his desk, his attention focused on a stack of papers in front of him. He looked calm, composed, as though nothing had happened, and for a brief moment I wondered if I'd imagined it all. But then he glanced up, his eyes meeting mine, and in that instant I knew the connection was still there. Unspoken but undeniable. I slipped into my seat, keeping my head down as the class began. His voice carried the same confident ease it always did, but I couldn't stop myself from analyzing every word, every inflection, searching for something, anything, that would reveal what he was thinking. The lesson passed in a blur. The steady rhythm of his voice both soothing and distracting. I tried to focus, to lose myself in the familiar comfort of his teaching. But my mind kept drifting back to the bathroom, to the way his hand had felt on mine, the way his lips had brushed against mine with such quiet intensity. When the bell rang, I stayed seated, my hands gripping the edges of my desk as the other students filed out. My heart was racing, my palms damp with sweat as I debated whether to stay or leave. Part of me wanted to run, to avoid the inevitable conversation. But another part, a louder, braver part, needed to know where we stood. "Hey." His voice broke through my thoughts. Soft but steady. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat as I saw him standing beside my desk. His expression was calm, But his eyes held that same intensity that had left me breathless the day before. "You okay?" he asked, his tone laced with quiet concern. I nodded, though the lump in my throat made it hard to speak. "Yeah," I managed to say, my voice barely audible. He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice lowering slightly. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding as I nodded again. "Okay." He gestured toward the door, waiting until the last of the students had left before closing it softly behind them. The room felt impossibly quiet now. The hum of the overhead light the only sound as he leaned against the edge of his desk, crossing his arms over his chest. "I've been thinking about yesterday," he began, his voice calm but measured. "About what happened." I nodded, my chest tightening as I waited for him to continue. "I don't regret it," he said, his words sending a jolt through me. "But I need you to know that it's complicated." "I know," I said quickly, my voice trembling, "but I don't want to pretend it didn't happen." His expression softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But we have to be careful. For both our sakes." The weight of his words settled over me, and I nodded slowly, understanding what he meant, even if it made my chest ache. "So, what now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He let out a long breath, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before meeting mine again. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I know I care about you more than I should." The vulnerability in his voice made my chest tighten, and I felt a flicker of hope despite the uncertainty that loomed over us. "I care about you too," I said softly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He smiled then, a real smile that lit up his face and made my heart race. "We'll figure this out," he said, his tone filled with quiet determination. "Together." And in that moment, as the weight of the world seemed to lift just slightly, I believed him. I am still not sure if it is normal that I have this with my teacher, but I don't really mind. What do you think of it? Let me know in the comments.